I didn't start this investigation looking for a cover-up. I started with a simple question. Why do major museums have basements? Not storage rooms, not conservation labs. Basement levels that don't appear on public floor plans. Sub-levels with restricted access. Entire wings that exist in construction records but not in visitor guides. I assumed bureaucracy, budget constraints, renovation delays. Then I started cross-referencing acquisition records with public display inventories. And the numbers didn't match. Not slightly, not by a rounding error, by tens of thousands of items. The Smithsonian Institution's own internal reports acknowledge receiving over 18,000 archaeological specimens between 1880 and 1930 that have no corresponding display record, no published catalog entry, and no publicly accessible storage location. 18,000 items gone from the record. Not lost, not destroyed, simply unaccounted for. Here's what made the pattern impossible to ignore. It wasn't random categories of objects going missing from the record. It was specific ones. Oversized skeletal remains, human bones suggesting heights significantly beyond normal population ranges, skulls with unusual cranial measurements, artifacts associated with burials containing these remains. And here's the detail that changes everything. These weren't fringe finds reported by amateurs. They were excavated by professional archaeologists, documented by state geological surveys, shipped to institutional addresses with signed transfer receipts. The paperwork exists. The objects don't. Go to the Smithsonian's online database. I know, but stay with me. Search their public collections for skeletal remains from the 1880 to 1920 excavation period. Notice what's cataloged. Notice the measurements recorded. Notice which entries contain full documentation chains and which contain only accession numbers with no corresponding physical location. Then request access to the physical items behind those accession numbers. You'll receive a response. It will be polite. It will cite ongoing conservation work, restricted research access, scheduling limitations. What it won't tell you is where the objects actually are. Come back and tell me in the comments what response you received, because the pattern I found wasn't one institution behaving unusually, it was dozens across 3 countries, across 60 years, behaving identically. Here's what the mainstream explanation offers. Institutional reorganization, storage system transitions, objects reclassified under different catalog systems during the 1950s modernization of museum collections. And individually, each explanation sounds reasonable, plausible even. But here's what doesn't fit. Institutional reorganization doesn't produce uniform gaps in specific object categories while leaving adjacent categories fully documented. Storage transitions don't result in objects with complete intake records having no corresponding output location. Reclassification doesn't explain why the gaps cluster so precisely around objects with anomalous measurements, while standard-sized material from identical excavations remains fully traceable. The gaps aren't random, they're surgical. Let me be precise about what I'm not claiming. I'm not saying every unusual archaeological find represents evidence of a lost civilization. I'm not saying institutional record gaps prove deliberate suppression in every case. But I am saying this. When you map the specific categories of missing material, when you trace the timeline of disappearances against the careers of specific institutional directors, when you read the internal correspondence that occasionally surfaces through Freedom of Information requests, a picture emerges that is difficult to explain through accident alone. In 1968, an internal Smithsonian memo obtained through FOIA requests discusses what it calls the curation policy for materially anomalous biological specimens. The memo is partially redacted. What remains visible describes a policy of removing certain categories of skeletal material from public research access pending further institutional review. That review was initiated in 1968. It has never been concluded. The material remains inaccessible. Here's the layer that most investigators miss. It's not just what disappeared from museum collections, it's what disappeared from peer-reviewed anthropological journals. Between 1870 and 1920, peer-reviewed anthropological journals published dozens of papers describing excavations that yielded remains with anomalous measurements. These papers are cited in later literature, but when you request the original journal issues from university library archives, you encounter something strange. Specific issues are missing. Not the journals, not the volumes, specific issues, the ones containing those specific papers. University of Pennsylvania's library archives show a gap in their Proceedings of the Academy of Natural Sciences collection that corresponds precisely to issues containing anomalous skeletal reports from the 1890s. Harvard's Peabody Museum Library has similar gaps. The British Museum's library catalog acknowledges receiving issues that are no longer physically present. Different institutions, same gaps, same years. The private collections complicate this further, because while public institutional records show these systematic absences, private collections tell a different story. There are estate libraries, inherited collections, private museums operating outside public access requirements that contain exactly the categories of material missing from official collections. I have to be careful here, or this video disappears before you finish watching it. But the families connected to these collections share certain characteristics. They appear in the founding boards of the institutions where the gaps occur. They appear in the correspondence of the directors who implemented the curation policies. They appear in the donor records of the universities whose journals show the suspicious missing issues. What sits in those locked rooms? What measurements were deemed too significant to share with the public institutions their owners publicly funded? Why did material vanish from collections they controlled professionally while surviving in collections they owned privately? Let me ground this in something you can verify yourself. Go to any state historical society in the American Midwest. Request access to archaeological survey records from 1875 to 1920. You'll find them. They're often well preserved. Read the transfer records. Note where objects were sent. Then contact the receiving institution and request access to those specific accession numbers. Document what response you receive. Do this with 3 institutions. Then map your results against the pattern I've described. Because the pattern isn't hidden, it's in plain sight in publicly accessible records. What's hidden is what the records point to. Consider the architectural evidence alongside the documentary gaps. Major museums constructed between 1880 and 1920 were constructed with basement storage capacities far exceeding their documented collections the institution officially acknowledges holding. The excess space was planned. The construction records confirm it. The official explanation for why that space exists remains, after a century, unspecified. I keep returning to a specific set of correspondence. Letters between Smithsonian directors and field archaeologists from the 1990s. The language is consistent. Retain locally pending further instruction. Do not publish measurements prior to institutional review. Transfer via secure arrangement, documentation to follow separately. Documentation that never followed. Instructions that arrived before excavations were complete. Institutional awareness of finds that preceded any official notification. Someone knew what would be found before it was found, or knew what to look for once it was found, and knew exactly what to do with it afterward. The official explanation that institutional gaps represent normal archival entropy collapses under the weight of a simple question. Why these objects specifically? Why not the pottery? Why not the tools? Why not the ordinary human remains from the same excavations which remain fully documented and publicly accessible? The gaps aren't in the archive. The gaps are shaped, and shaped gaps aren't accidents. They're decisions. So what was in those measurements? What did those skeletal remains show that required a coordinated institutional response spanning 3 countries and 6 decades? We can't know for certainty. That's precisely the mechanism. You cannot question what you cannot access. You cannot challenge claims built on measurements that no longer appear in any accessible record. You cannot verify claims about the past when the physical evidence has been removed from every institution with a public access requirement. What remains is inference, the intake records that show objects arriving, the accession numbers attached to no physical location, the internal memos describing curation policies that were never made public, the private collections whose contents we can only guess at from the gaps they correspond to in public archives, and the architectural blueprints of buildings constructed with storage space for objects that officially do not exist. Maybe the explanation is benign. Maybe 60 years of consistent institutional behavior across multiple countries represents nothing more than parallel bureaucratic dysfunction. Maybe the gaps are coincidence. But ask yourself one question. If you wanted to remove something from public knowledge without destroying the evidence entirely, without creating the kind of obvious absence that invites investigation, what would you do? You'd keep the intake records, you'd maintain the accession numbers, you'd preserve just enough documentation to demonstrate institutional process, and then you'd move the objects somewhere the process couldn't follow, somewhere with no public access requirement, somewhere that the same families who ran the institutions could control indefinitely. You'd need decades of consistent policy. You'd need institutional authority across multiple countries. And then you'd need everyone to accept the gaps as coincidence. The basements exist. The records confirm the gaps. The private collections remain sealed. And we are left, as always, with what we were permitted to find. Everything else is in a room we'll never enter. If this investigation raised questions you want answered, the next video goes deeper. The specific families, the specific institutions, the specific timeline of policy changes that correspond with suspicious precision to the peak years of anomalous discovery. Subscribe, and I'll see you there.